This is the story of how I turned my husband's attempt to humiliate me with his high-powered lawyer into the most satisfying victory of my life, and how one phone call completely destroyed the future he thought he had planned. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. My name is Elena, and for privacy reasons, I'll be using different names throughout this story. What I'm about to tell you happened in the charming coastal town of Millbrook Harbor, where appearances matter more than truth, and where my soon-to-be ex-husband thought his reputation would protect him from the consequences of his actions. I'm a forensic accountant, yes, the kind that follows money trails and uncovers financial secrets that people desperately want to keep hidden. For the past 8 years, I've worked with some of the most prestigious law firms in our state, helping them build cases that seemed impossible to win. My specialty? Finding assets that wealthy individuals try to hide during divorces, business disputes, and fraud investigations. It's meticulous work that requires patience, attention to detail, and an almost obsessive need to uncover the truth. These skills, as you'll see, would prove invaluable in ways I never imagined. My husband, Cameron Westfield, owned Westfield Maritime Holdings, a luxury yacht brokerage that catered to the ultra-wealthy along our stretch of the Atlantic coast. To everyone in Millbrook Harbor, Cameron was the golden boy, charming, successful, and seemingly devoted to his wife of 12 years. He drove a midnight blue Porsche, wore custom-tailored suits, and had a smile that could convince anyone to trust him with their most valuable possessions. What the town didn't know was that behind closed doors, Cameron had been systematically destroying our marriage while building his exit strategy. If you like the story of our channel, please like the channel, and if you are interested in these stories, join our channel membership. Thank you. Our home was a stunning Victorian mansion on Seaview Drive, overlooking the harbor where million-dollar yachts bobbed peacefully in their slips. From the outside, we looked like the perfect power couple. I handled the finances for several prominent families in town, while Cameron sealed deals with handshakes and champagne toasts. We attended charity galas, hosted dinner parties, and smiled for photos in the local society pages. But perfection, as I've learned, is often just a carefully constructed illusion. The cracks in our marriage had been forming for years, though I didn't recognize them at first. Cameron began working longer hours, claiming that the luxury yacht market was more competitive than ever. Weekend sailing trips with potential clients became routine. His phone was always face down on the table, and he developed a habit of taking calls in his study with the door locked. When I'd ask about his day, his responses became increasingly vague, just client meetings and industry networking. As a forensic accountant, I'm trained to notice inconsistencies, but love has a way of making us blind to the obvious. I convinced myself that Cameron's distant behavior was just stress from running a demanding business. After all, he was still bringing home significant income, and our lifestyle certainly reflected his success. We had everything we thought we wanted: the house, the cars, the social status, the respect of our community. But there were signs I should have recognized sooner. The way Cameron would suddenly end phone conversations when I entered the room. How he'd become protective of his laptop, always closing it when I walked by. The subtle changes in his appearance. New cologne, more attention to his grooming, clothes that seemed chosen to impress someone other than his wife. Most telling of all was how he'd stopped talking about our future together. No more discussions about renovating the house, planning vacations, or even simple things like weekend plans. What I didn't know was that Cameron had been planning his escape for months, maybe even years. While I was building my reputation as one of the most thorough forensic accountants in the region, he was busy creating a web of financial arrangements designed to protect his assets from exactly the kind of investigation I specialized in. The irony wasn't lost on me later. He was married to someone whose job it was to uncover hidden assets, yet he believed he was clever enough to hide his own. Cameron's confidence came from his connections. His lawyer, Theodore Blackstone, was a partner at Blackstone, Rivers and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. They'd handled divorces for senators, CEOs, and old money families for generations. Theodore was known for his ruthless tactics and his ability to make inconvenient spouses disappear quietly, usually with minimal financial impact to his clients. Cameron had watched Theodore destroy other marriages in our social circle, and he was convinced that the same strategy would work on me. What Cameron didn't understand was that my work had put me in contact with dozens of lawyers who'd gone up against Theodore Blackstone. I'd seen his playbook, witnessed his tactics, and most importantly, I'd helped other attorneys find the weaknesses in his seemingly impenetrable cases. But Cameron saw me as just his wife, someone who handled small-time financial investigations for local law firms. He had no idea that my client list included some of the most powerful people in the state, or that my reputation extended far beyond our little coastal town. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both our lives forever. Cameron thought he held all the cards, the money, the lawyer, the social connections, and the element of surprise. What he didn't know was that he was about to go up against someone who'd spent years learning exactly how to dismantle the kind of carefully constructed financial empire he'd built. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. The warning signs I'd been ignoring became impossible to dismiss during what I now call the Summer of Secrets. It started with small changes that, individually, seemed insignificant. But when you're trained to spot patterns in financial data, you eventually notice patterns in behavior too. Cameron's work schedule became increasingly erratic. He'd leave for client meetings at unusual hours, sometimes as early as 6 a.m. for breakfast negotiations or as late as 9 p.m. for evening consultations. The luxury yacht business, he explained, operated on the schedules of wealthy clients who lived in different time zones and had unconventional availability. It seemed reasonable enough, except that I'd handled the books for yacht brokers before, and their meeting patterns never looked like this. His phone habits changed dramatically. Cameron had always been attached to his device, it was essential for his business, but now it never left his side. He took it to the bathroom, kept it on the nightstand while sleeping, and would snatch it up with lightning speed whenever a notification chimed. When I'd casually ask who was calling at such odd hours, he'd dismiss it as international clients or West Coast investors. The explanations became increasingly elaborate, which should have been my first real red flag. Then there were the business trips. Cameron's travel schedule had always been busy, but suddenly he was flying to yacht shows and maritime exhibitions I'd never heard of. Fort Lauderdale, Newport, Monaco, places that sounded legitimate for his industry. But when I tried to look up these events online out of genuine interest in his work, half of them didn't seem to exist, or the dates didn't match his travel itinerary. When I mentioned this discrepancy, Cameron became defensive, accusing me of not trusting him and not understanding the private, invitation-only nature of high-end yacht sales. The financial irregularities were perhaps the most telling, though I didn't piece them together immediately. Our joint account showed unusual patterns, large deposits followed by immediate transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. When I asked Cameron about them, he explained they were client deposits that needed to be moved to escrow accounts for yacht purchases. It was plausible, except that the amounts and timing didn't align with any standard maritime transaction protocols I was familiar with. Cameron's attitude toward me began shifting in subtle but unmistakable ways. He started making comments about my work that felt designed to diminish my professional accomplishments. Elena's just helping with some local bookkeeping, he'd say when people asked about my forensic accounting practice, completely ignoring the fact that I'd recently helped resolve a multi-million-dollar embezzlement case for one of the state's largest law firms. He'd interrupt me during conversations at social events, redirecting attention to his own business achievements. More concerning was how he began isolating me from mutual friends and business contacts. He'd schedule social commitments without consulting me, then apologize at the last minute, saying he'd forgotten to mention them or that they were business-only events. Slowly, I found myself excluded from the social circle we built together in Millbrook Harbor. People I'd considered close friends seemed to be pulling away, and I couldn't understand why. The most painful change was in our intimate relationship. Cameron became emotionally distant, treating our marriage like a business arrangement rather than a partnership. Conversations about our future together became non-existent. When I'd bring up plans for renovating our house or taking a vacation together, he'd deflect with vague statements about waiting to see how the business develops or keeping our options open. Physical intimacy disappeared almost entirely. Cameron claimed the stress of expanding his business was affecting his energy levels, but I noticed he seemed to have plenty of energy for his mysterious evening meetings and weekend client entertainment activities. He'd come home from these events energized and almost euphoric, which seemed odd for someone supposedly exhausted by work demands. Perhaps the most telling incident happened during a charity gala at the Millbrook Harbor Yacht Club. I was talking with Jennifer Hartwell, the wife of a prominent local attorney, when she made an offhand comment that stopped me cold. "I saw Cameron at the Harbor View restaurant last Tuesday," she said. "He looked like he was having quite the romantic dinner." You're so lucky to have a husband who still plans surprise date nights after all these years. The problem was that Cameron had told me he was in Boston that Tuesday for a yacht show. When I confronted him about it later that evening, he became angry, not defensive, but genuinely angry that I would question his integrity based on gossip from bored housewives. He turned the situation around, making me feel guilty for bringing it up and accusing me of being paranoid and distrustful. This pattern of gaslighting became more frequent. Whenever I questioned inconsistencies in his stories or expressed concern about his behavior, Cameron would twist the conversation to make me the problem. I was being controlling, insecure, or unable to handle his success. He'd remind me that his business was thriving, that we lived in a beautiful house, and that I should be grateful for the life he was providing rather than constantly questioning his every move. The isolation and psychological manipulation began taking its toll. I started doubting my own perceptions and wondering if I was indeed being paranoid. But my professional training in forensic accounting had taught me to trust data over emotions, and the data was telling a clear story, one that Cameron desperately didn't want me to read. What I didn't know yet was that while I was analyzing these behavioral patterns, Cameron was putting the final pieces of his exit strategy into place. He'd been building his case for months, gathering ammunition to use against me when the time came to end our marriage on his terms. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October, during what should have been a routine evening at home. Cameron had claimed he was working late at the marina, finalizing paperwork for a major yacht sale to a client from Palm Beach. I was in my home office, reviewing financial documents for a fraud case I was building for Meridian and Associates. When I heard Cameron's Porsche pull into our driveway much earlier than expected, I glanced at the clock, 7:30 p.m. He told me he wouldn't be home until after 10 p.m. because of the complex negotiations requiring his personal attention. When he walked through the front door, he seemed flustered and distracted, immediately heading upstairs without his usual greeting. Something about his demeanor felt off, like someone who'd been caught off guard rather than someone finishing a successful business meeting. 20 minutes later, Cameron came back downstairs in casual clothes, announcing he needed to run back to the office because he'd forgotten some important documents. This struck me as odd since he'd just come from the office, and in 12 years of marriage, I'd never known him to be forgetful about business matters. But what really caught my attention was his phone. He'd left it on the kitchen counter. Something that never happened. For about 10 minutes, I stared at that phone, fighting an internal battle between respect for privacy and my growing suspicion that something was seriously wrong. The device kept lighting up with notifications, and I could see partial message previews on the lock screen. Finally, my forensic training won over my conscience. I needed to know what was happening to my marriage. The phone was protected by a passcode, but I knew Cameron well enough to guess it, our wedding anniversary, the same code he'd used for years. What I found when I scrolled through his messages destroyed any remaining illusions I had about our relationship. The conversation thread with someone named Vivien Sterling contained months of intimate messages that made my stomach turn. But These weren't just casual affair messages, they were detailed discussions about their future together, including plans that involved Cameron's business and our shared assets. Vivien wasn't just his mistress, she was his business partner in ways that extended far beyond the yacht brokerage. The messages revealed that Vivien had been helping Cameron establish offshore accounts and shell companies designed to hide assets. From what they referred to as the inevitable divorce proceedings. They discussed specific strategies for moving money, timing the separation to maximize Cameron's financial advantage, and even mentioned Theodore Blackstone by name as someone who would handle the wife problem efficiently. One particular exchange from 3 weeks earlier made my blood run cold. Cameron, Theodore says the key is to establish a pattern of Elena being unstable and financially irresponsible. We need documentation. Vivien, already working on it. The gambling addiction angle might work. I can create paper trails showing large cash withdrawals that can't be accounted for. Cameron, perfect. By the time we're done, she'll be lucky to get spousal support, let alone half the business. I screenshotted everything, my hands shaking as I documented their conspiracy against me. There were photos of them together at restaurants, on yachts, at what appeared to be business meetings with people I didn't recognize. But the most damaging evidence was in their discussions about financial manipulation, detailed plans to defraud me during divorce proceedings using fabricated evidence and hidden assets. The scope of their deception was staggering. Cameron hadn't just been having an affair, he'd been conducting a calculated campaign to destroy my reputation and steal assets that were rightfully mine. They'd been planning this for over 8 months, timing every move to ensure maximum damage to my position. When they finally pulled the trigger. As I continued reading, I discovered that Vivien Sterling wasn't just some random woman Cameron had met. She was a former paralegal who'd been disbarred for financial misconduct 3 years earlier. Her expertise in legal loopholes and document manipulation had made her the perfect partner for Cameron's scheme. Together, they'd created a web of false companies, fake transactions, and forged documents designed to make it appear that Cameron's business was struggling financially while secretly funneling profits into accounts I would never be able to trace. The messages also revealed that they'd been monitoring my activities, including my work schedule, client meetings, and even my conversations with friends. They knew about my forensic accounting cases and had been specifically timing their moves to avoid detection during periods when I was particularly busy with work. Cameron had been using his intimate knowledge of my professional methods to stay one step ahead of exactly the kind of investigation I specialized in conducting, but perhaps the most infuriating discovery was their timeline. According to their messages, Cameron planned to file for divorce within the next 2 weeks, using Thanksgiving as cover to spend time apart before delivering the final blow during what should have been our holiday season. They'd already prepared false evidence of my supposed gambling addiction, complete with forged withdrawal slips and fabricated witness statements from people they paid to lie about seeing me at casinos. The cruelest part was how they mocked my professional abilities in their private conversations. Cameron had told Vivien that I was too trusting and emotional to properly investigate his activities, despite being a forensic accountant. They actually laughed about how I'd been sleeping next to the evidence for months without realizing what was happening. As I finished documenting their communications, I heard Cameron's car returning to the driveway. I quickly closed all the applications, returned his phone to exactly where he'd left it, and retreated to my office. When he walked back inside, he seemed relieved to see his phone undisturbed, unaware that I now possessed enough evidence to destroy both his personal and professional life. That night, as Cameron slept peacefully beside me, believing his secret was safe, I lay awake planning my response. They thought they were dealing with a naive wife who could be easily manipulated and discarded. What they didn't realize was that they just declared war on someone who specialized in uncovering exactly the kind of financial fraud they'd been committing. The hunter had become the hunted, and they had no idea what was coming. 2 weeks later, Cameron executed his plan with the precision of a military operation, but not before delivering a psychological blow that revealed the true depth of his cruelty. The attack came on a Saturday morning that had started like any other weekend in Our Millbrook Harbor home. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Cameron walked in, dressed in one of his expensive suits despite having no scheduled appointments. His demeanor was different, cold, calculated, and strangely confident. He sat down at our breakfast table with the air of someone about to deliver a rehearsed speech. "Elena, we need to talk," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth or familiarity. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about our marriage, and I've come to some difficult conclusions." I set down my coffee cup, my heart racing despite knowing what was coming. "What kind of conclusions?" Cameron's response was delivered with chilling detachment. "This marriage isn't working anymore. You've become different, distant, unreliable. I've tried to ignore it, but your behavior has become increasingly concerning, especially your financial habits." The accusation hit like a slap. My financial habits? "Cameron, what are you talking about?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder, spreading documents across our breakfast table with theatrical precision. "These are bank statements showing irregular cash withdrawals from your personal account. Large amounts, Elena. Amounts that you can't seem to explain when I've asked about them." I stared at the documents in disbelief. They were indeed bank statements, with my name on them, showing significant cash withdrawals over the past 6 months. But I had never made these transactions. "Cameron, I didn't make these withdrawals. These statements, they're not real." His laugh was bitter and condescending. "Elena, denying it only makes this worse. I've spoken with Dr. Pemberton about your behavior patterns, and he agrees that you're showing signs of addictive behavior that needs professional intervention." Dr. Pemberton was our family physician, someone I'd trusted for years. The betrayal cut deep. "You discussed our private matters with Dr. Pemberton without my consent?" "I was concerned about my wife's mental health," Cameron replied smoothly. "He's recommended a treatment facility in Vermont that specializes in gambling addiction. I think it would be beneficial for you to get the help you need." The manufactured concern in his voice made my skin crawl. This was exactly what I'd seen in his messages with Vivien. They'd planned to paint me as mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. But experiencing it firsthand was more devastating than I'd anticipated. "I don't have a gambling addiction, Cameron. I've never been to a casino in my life, and you know it." Cameron's expression shifted to one of exaggerated patience, the kind reserved for dealing with someone who's mentally compromised. "Elena, I have witnesses who've seen you at the Riverside Casino Resort on multiple occasions. People who care about you and are willing to testify about your behavior." The fabricated evidence was more elaborate than I'd expected. They'd actually recruited people to lie about seeing me gambling. The level of premeditation was staggering. "This is insane. Cameron. You're making this up." His demeanor suddenly turned hostile, dropping the pretense of concern. "I'm done enabling your destructive behavior, Elena. I've already spoken with Theodore Blackstone about protecting our assets from your financial irresponsibility. He's recommended that we separate immediately, before you can do any more damage to what I've built." There it was, the real agenda. Cameron stood up from the table, his performance reaching its crescendo. "I want you out of this house by tomorrow evening. Theodore will be in touch about the divorce proceedings, and I suggest you get yourself a good lawyer. You're going to need one." The coldness in his voice was absolute. This was the man I'd shared 12 years of my life with, standing in our kitchen and systematically destroying my reputation with fabricated evidence and paid witnesses. "You want me to call your lawyer?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled despite the rage building inside me. "I want you to face reality, Elena. This marriage is over, and your behavior has made it impossible for me to trust you with financial decisions. Theodore will explain your limited options during the divorce proceedings. Cameron picked up his folder of fake documents and headed toward the door. I'll be staying at the Harbor View Hotel until you've moved out. Don't try to contact me directly. All communication goes through Theodore from now on. As he reached the doorway, he delivered his final blow. And Elena? Don't even think about trying to claim half of my business. With your documented financial instability and the prenuptial agreement you signed, you'll be lucky to get spousal support. The mention of a prenuptial agreement made my blood freeze. We'd never signed a prenup, I was absolutely certain of that. But Cameron's confidence suggested they'd fabricated that document too. After Cameron left, I sat alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of the life we built together, trying to process the calculated cruelty of what had just happened. He hadn't just filed for divorce. He'd constructed an elaborate fiction designed to destroy my credibility and steal everything I was entitled to: the forged bank statements, the bribed witnesses, the fake prenuptial agreement, the manipulation of our family doctor. Every detail had been planned to ensure I would be left with nothing. Cameron and Vivien had spent months building a case against me that would be difficult to defend, especially if I'd been the naive wife they assumed I was. But as I sat there, instead of feeling defeated, I felt something else entirely: a cold, calculating anger that reminded me why I'd become so successful at forensic accounting. Cameron had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd shown me his entire playbook, revealed all his fabricated evidence, and given me exactly what I needed to destroy him. He wanted me to call his lawyer? I was definitely going to call Theodore Blackstone. But not for the reasons Cameron expected. The war had officially begun, and Cameron had no idea that he just armed his opponent with everything she needed to win. That Saturday evening, alone in what had been our home for 8 years, I opened my personal safe and retrieved documents that Cameron had never known existed. While he'd been busy constructing his elaborate deception, I'd been quietly building something far more powerful: a comprehensive record of our real financial picture that would expose every lie he just presented. The first revelation was a document that would completely destroy Cameron's fabricated prenuptial agreement story. Hidden in my safe was our actual marriage certificate and every piece of paperwork from our wedding planning process. Not only had we never signed a prenup, but I had documentation proving that Cameron had specifically refused to sign one when I'd suggested it during our engagement. My attorney at the time, Rebecca Marshall, had advised all her clients to consider prenuptial agreements, and I'd kept her email correspondence where Cameron had responded that he trusted our love completely and found the idea insulting and unnecessary. More damaging still, I possessed something Cameron didn't know existed: a power of attorney document he'd signed 3 years earlier when he'd been hospitalized after a sailing accident. During his recovery, he'd given me full access to his business accounts to handle urgent transactions. What Cameron had forgotten was that this document also granted me legal access to his financial records, including accounts he thought were private. I'd never used this access inappropriately, but I'd also never formally revoked it. But my most powerful weapon was something I'd been building unintentionally for years: a complete forensic trail of Cameron's actual business operations. As a forensic accountant, I'd developed a habit of maintaining detailed financial records for tax purposes. Every joint account transaction, every business expense that touched our personal finances, every investment decision Cameron had made was documented in my professional-grade record-keeping system. What made this documentation devastating was its accuracy. I could prove exactly when Cameron's behavior had changed, correlating it with specific financial irregularities that painted a clear picture of when his affair with Vivien had begun and when they'd started moving money. The timeline of their relationship was written in bank transfers, unexplained cash withdrawals, and business expenses that didn't match any legitimate yacht sales. More importantly, I had evidence of Cameron's real financial worth that contradicted every claim he was likely to make in divorce proceedings. His business wasn't just successful, it was extraordinarily profitable, with hidden revenue streams he'd kept secret even from me. The offshore accounts and shell companies he'd created with Vivien weren't just for hiding assets from me. They were for tax evasion on a massive scale. During my marriage, I'd occasionally provided informal consulting on Cameron's business taxes, helping him understand depreciation schedules and business expense categories. What he didn't realize was that my professional training had allowed me to spot discrepancies between what he was reporting to the IRS and what his actual income appeared to be. I'd kept notes about these irregularities, initially thinking they were honest mistakes, but now understanding they were part of a systematic pattern of tax fraud. The evidence extended beyond financial records. I'd been documenting Cameron's behavioral changes with the same methodical approach I used in fraud investigations. Dates, times, inconsistencies in his stories, phone records showing calls to numbers I'd later identified as belonging to Vivien Sterling. Without realizing it, I'd been building a case against my own husband for months. But perhaps my most valuable asset was my professional network. Cameron saw me as just a local forensic accountant, but my reputation extended far beyond Millbrook Harbor. I'd worked with federal investigators on money laundering cases, assisted the FBI with financial crimes investigations, and maintained relationships with some of the most respected attorneys in the region. These weren't casual professional acquaintances, these were people who owed me favors, who knew my work intimately, and who would be more than willing to help me expose the kind of financial fraud Cameron and Vivien had been committing. Point 1. Phone call to my colleague Detective Sarah Chin at the Financial Crimes Unit would open an investigation into Cameron's offshore accounts. Another call to federal prosecutor James Rodriguez would trigger a review of Cameron's tax filings for the past 5 years. These weren't threats I was making lightly. I had enough evidence to suggest serious federal crimes, and the professional relationships to ensure those allegations would be taken seriously. The irony was that Cameron's own success had given me additional leverage he didn't understand. Westfield Maritime Holdings wasn't just a local business, it was a registered dealer for several major yacht manufacturers, which meant Cameron held federal licensing that could be revoked for financial crimes. His clients included people whose assets were subject to federal oversight, making his business activities a matter of national security interest in some cases. Even more devastating for Cameron was my knowledge of his client base. As his wife, I'd attended countless business dinners and yacht club events where I'd met his most important customers. I knew which clients were buying yachts with questionable financing, which purchases involved cash transactions that should have been reported to federal authorities, and which of Cameron's deals appeared to violate maritime commerce regulations. What Cameron and Vivien had failed to understand was that financial fraud wasn't just a civil matter in divorce proceedings. It was a federal crime that could result in prison time, asset forfeiture, and the complete destruction of everything Cameron had built. By involving fabricated evidence and bribed witnesses, they'd escalated their scheme from adultery and asset hiding to criminal conspiracy, racketeering, and fraud. As I organized my evidence that evening, I realized that Cameron had handed me something invaluable, a complete confession of his criminal activities, documented in his own text messages with his co-conspirator. Every illegal transaction, every fraudulent document, every plan to defraud me was preserved in writing, with timestamps and digital signatures that would be impossible to deny in court. The man who thought he was dealing with a naive, emotionally compromised wife was actually facing someone who specialized in exactly the kind of investigation that would expose his entire criminal enterprise. Cameron wanted me to call his lawyer? I was definitely going to make that call, but first, I was going to make some other calls that would ensure Theodore Blackstone understood exactly what kind of case he just agreed to handle. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity about what needed to be done. I'd spent Sunday organizing my evidence into a prosecution quality case file, and now it was time to execute a strategy that would systematically dismantle Cameron's carefully constructed lies. My first call would indeed be to Theodore Blackstone. But not as the defeated wife Cameron expected. At exactly 9 a.m., I dialed Blackstone, Rivers and Associates and asked to speak with Theodore directly. His secretary, clearly following instructions, informed me that Mr. Blackstone would only discuss my case during a formal consultation scheduled through proper channels. I smiled as I delivered my response. Please tell Mr. Blackstone that Elena Hartwell is calling regarding the Westfield matter and that I have some federal evidence that might interest him before he files any paperwork. I'll hold. The magic words federal evidence had the desired effect. Within 2 minutes, Theodore's distinguished voice came through the line, professional but cautious. Mrs. Westfield, I understand you'd like to discuss your upcoming divorce proceedings. I should mention that your husband has briefed me on your situation, and I think it would be beneficial for everyone if we could handle this matter quietly and efficiently. His tone was perfectly calibrated, sympathetic but firm, suggesting that resistance would be futile. Theodore Blackstone had probably delivered the same speech to dozens of soon-to-be ex-wives over his career. Mr. Blackstone, I appreciate your time, and I think you're absolutely right about handling this efficiently. That's why I wanted to speak with you before you file anything that might create unnecessary complications. What kind of complications, Mrs. Westfield? I opened the file in front of me, filled with screenshots of Cameron's text messages and financial documentation. Well, Theodore, may I call you Theodore? I'm concerned that Cameron may not have provided you with complete information about our financial situation or the circumstances of our separation. There was a pause. Mrs. Westfield, I can assure you that my client has been thorough in his disclosure. However, if you have additional information that's relevant to property division, I'm willing to listen. I'm not talking about property division, Theodore. I'm talking about federal banking violations, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I think you should know that the evidence Cameron plans to present regarding my supposed gambling addiction consists entirely of fabricated documents and perjured testimony. The silence that followed was profound. When Theodore finally spoke, his voice had lost its confident authority. Mrs. Westfield, those are serious allegations. Do you have documentation to support these claims? I have Cameron's complete text message history with his co-conspirator, including detailed discussions of how they plan to frame me with fake evidence. I have financial records proving the existence of undisclosed offshore accounts used for tax evasion. And I have evidence that the witnesses Cameron plans to use have been paid to provide false testimony. I let that information sink in before continuing. But here's what I think you really need to know, Theodore. I'm not just Cameron's wife, I'm a forensic accountant who specializes in financial crimes investigations. I've spent the last 3 years working with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit on cases very similar to what Cameron and his girlfriend have been doing. Another long pause. I see. Mrs. Westfield, I think it might be beneficial for us to meet in person to discuss this matter further. I was hoping you'd say that. But before we meet, you should know that I've already forwarded copies of the evidence to Federal Prosecutor James Rodriguez and Detective Sarah Chin at the Financial Crimes Unit. They're reviewing the material to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. This wasn't entirely true yet, but it would be by the end of the day. Sometimes in negotiations, you had to present your next move as if it had already happened. Mrs. Westfield, Theodore's voice was now noticeably strained. I think there may be some misunderstandings here that we could resolve through proper legal channels. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting for later this week? Actually, Theodore, I'm free this afternoon. How does 3 p.m. work for you? And you might want to suggest that Cameron attend as well. I think he should hear what I have to say directly. I'm not sure that's advisable given the emotional nature of this situation. Oh, there's nothing emotional about this, Theodore. This is purely professional. I'm offering Cameron and his attorney an opportunity to understand the federal implications of their actions before law enforcement gets involved. I'd consider that a courtesy. After ending the call with Theodore, I immediately began implementing the next phase of my strategy. My first call was to James Rodriguez, the federal prosecutor I'd worked with on 3 major financial crimes cases. James had once told me that if I ever needed a favor, I should call him directly. Elena! What a pleasant surprise. How's life in Millbrook Harbor treating you? Not as well as I'd hoped, James. I'm calling because I've uncovered what appears to be a significant financial fraud scheme, and I think it might interest your office. I spent 20 minutes walking James through the evidence, focusing on the federal tax implications and the interstate nature of Cameron's hidden accounts. James listened carefully, asking pointed questions about the documentation and the timeline of events. Elena, this sounds like exactly the kind of case we've been building expertise around. Can you send me the complete file for review? It's already being compiled for transmission. But James, there's something else you should know. The primary suspect in this scheme is my husband, and his attorney is Theodore Blackstone. James whistled softly. Theodore Blackstone? Elena, you realize what you're up against if you go to war with that firm? I'm counting on Theodore being smart enough to realize what he's up against if he goes to war with the FBI. My next call was to Detective Sarachin, who'd worked with me on money laundering investigations involving yacht sales and luxury goods. Sarah had always been impressed with my ability to trace hidden assets, and I knew she'd be interested in Cameron's operation. Sarah, I need to report a financial fraud scheme involving offshore accounts, tax evasion, and fabricated evidence. The suspects have been using yacht sales as a cover for money laundering operations. Elena, you know I trust your judgment completely. How solid is your evidence? Solid enough that I'm prepared to testify before a federal grand jury if necessary. By the time I finished my calls to law enforcement, word would already be spreading through the federal prosecutor's office that a major financial crimes case was developing in Millbrook Harbor. Theodore Blackstone's reputation might intimidate small-town lawyers and frighten spouses, but federal prosecutors weren't impressed by expensive suits and political connections. My final preparation for the afternoon meeting was to contact my own legal representation. I called Rebecca Marshall, the attorney who'd handled my real estate transactions and business contracts over the years. Rebecca specialized in federal white-collar defense and had successfully represented several clients in high-profile fraud cases. Rebecca, I need to retain you immediately for what's about to become a very complex divorce case with significant federal criminal implications. Elena, after all these years of working together, you know I'll make time for you. What are we dealing with? As I explained the situation to Rebecca, I could hear her taking notes and occasionally expressing amazement at the scope of Cameron's operation. Elena, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this course? Once we trigger federal investigations, there's no going back. Rebecca, they fabricated evidence to frame me for gambling addiction, bribed witnesses to perjure themselves, and committed tax fraud on a massive scale. I'm not just defending myself anymore, I'm making sure they face the consequences of their crimes. When I hung up with Rebecca, everything was in place for the afternoon confrontation. Theodore Blackstone thought he was meeting with a desperate wife who needed to be managed. Instead, he was about to discover that he'd agreed to represent someone whose crimes were already under federal investigation, and that the gambling addict he was supposed to destroy in court was actually the forensic accountant who'd built the case against his client, the conference room at Blackstone. Rivers and Associates felt like a courtroom as I walked in at exactly 3 p.m., carrying a leather briefcase that contained enough evidence to destroy both Cameron's freedom and his fortune. Theodore Blackstone sat at the head of a mahogany table. That probably cost more than most people's cars, his silver hair perfectly styled and his expression carefully neutral. Cameron sat to his right, dressed in his most expensive suit, radiating the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. What struck me immediately was how they positioned themselves, Theodore in the power seat, Cameron slightly behind him like a protected client, and two empty chairs across from them clearly intended to make me feel outnumbered and intimidated. It was psychological theater designed to reinforce their perceived advantage. "Elena," Cameron said with forced warmth, "I'm glad you decided to be reasonable about this. Theodore has explained how we can handle everything quietly and efficiently." I set my briefcase on the table and smiled pleasantly. "Hello, Cameron." "Theodore." I opened the case and began removing file folders, arranging them methodically in front of me. "I appreciate you both making time for this meeting. I think it's going to be very enlightening." Theodore leaned forward slightly, his practiced attorney demeanor fully engaged. "Mrs. Westfield, as I mentioned on the phone, your husband has provided me with comprehensive documentation of your financial irregularities and behavioral concerns. While we understand this is an emotional time, it's important that we address these issues constructively." I nodded thoughtfully and opened the first folder. "You're absolutely right, Theodore. Documentation is crucial. That's why I've brought some of my own." I slid a stack of papers across the table. These are printouts of text messages between Cameron and Vivien Sterling, discussing their plan to fabricate evidence against me. Cameron's face went pale as he recognized his own words on the pages. Theodore's expression shifted from confident control to careful attention as he began reading. "This conversation from September 15th is particularly interesting," I continued, pointing to a specific exchange. Cameron tells Vivien that they need to create fake bank statements showing gambling withdrawals, and Vivien responds with details about which printing company she's using to forge the documents. Theodore's hands stilled on the papers. Cameron started to speak, but I continued before he could interrupt. "The September 22nd conversation discusses bribing witnesses to testify about seeing me at casinos. Cameron specifically mentions paying Robert Chin $2,000 to claim he saw me gambling at Riverside Resort." I opened another folder. "I have Robert's bank deposit receipt for that exact amount, deposited the day after this conversation." Cameron finally found his voice. "Elena, those messages are taken out of context. Vivien and I were just discussing hypothetical scenarios." "Hypothetical scenarios?" I interrupted, sliding another document across the table. "This is a contract between Vivien Sterling and Apex Document Services for specialty printing projects. The invoice specifically mentions reproduction of bank statements and legal documents. The total cost was $3,400, paid from an account that Cameron opened under a false business name." Theodore set down the papers and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Westfield, these are serious allegations. Do you have additional evidence to support these claims?" I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward them. "This is a complete forensic analysis of Cameron's financial activities over the past 18 months. The highlighted transactions show systematic movement of money to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, totaling approximately $2.8 million in undeclared income." Cameron's confident facade cracked completely. "Elena, you have no right to access my business accounts. This is a violation of privacy. Actually, Cameron, I have every right." I produced the power of attorney document from my briefcase. "You signed this 3 years ago during your sailing accident recovery. It grants me full access to your financial records for business purposes. Since you've been using business accounts for personal fraud, everything you've done falls under this authorization." Theodore examined the document carefully, his expression growing increasingly grim. Mrs. Westfield, even if these allegations are accurate, there are proper legal channels for addressing financial discrepancies in divorce proceedings, Theodore. I don't think you understand the scope of what we're dealing with here. I opened another folder. This isn't just about divorce asset division. Cameron has been operating an international money laundering scheme using his yacht brokerage as a front. These transactions involve federal banking violations, tax evasion, and wire fraud across state lines. I placed a summary sheet in front of them. Cameron has failed to report $2.8 million in income over the past 5 years. The federal penalty for tax evasion of this magnitude is up to 5 years in prison and fines equal to the amount evaded. The money laundering charges carry additional sentences of up to 20 years. Cameron's hands were shaking now. Elena, you're blowing this completely out of proportion. These are just business transactions involving shell companies with fake addresses and signature cards signed under false names? I pulled out another document. Sterling Maritime Holdings, that's Vivien's company, exists only on paper. The address listed is a vacant lot in Delaware. Yet Cameron has transferred $847,000 to this non-existent company over the past year. Theodore had gone completely silent, studying each document with the intensity of someone calculating his own legal exposure. Finally, he looked up. Mrs. Westfield. I'm beginning to understand that this situation is more complex than my client initially indicated. It gets more complex, Theodore. I opened my phone and showed them a text message. This is from Federal Prosecutor James Rodriguez, sent 30 minutes ago. He's reviewed the evidence I provided and is scheduling a meeting with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit for tomorrow morning. Cameron shot up from his chair. Elena, you can't be serious. You called the FBI? I didn't just call them, Cameron. I've been working with them for 3 years on cases exactly like yours. They're very interested in your operation, especially the international aspects. Theodore's professional composure finally cracked. Mrs. Westfield, I think there may be some misunderstandings here that we could resolve through negotiation. The only misunderstanding, Theodore, is Cameron's belief that he could frame his forensic accountant wife with fabricated evidence while committing federal crimes under her nose. I began collecting my documents. But here's what's going to happen next. I looked directly at Cameron, who had slumped back into his chair looking utterly defeated. You have 24 hours to voluntarily disclose all hidden assets and cooperate with federal authorities. In exchange, I might be willing to recommend reduced charges when they ask for my professional opinion. Cameron's voice was barely a whisper. Elena, please. We can work this out. The divorce, the business, everything. Just don't destroy my life. Cameron, you destroyed your own life the moment you decided to commit federal crimes to frame your wife. I stood up and closed my briefcase. The only question now is whether you want to make this worse by continuing to lie. Theodore finally spoke, his voice lacking any of its earlier authority. Mrs. Westfield, what exactly are you proposing? I'm not proposing anything, Theodore. I'm informing you that your client is about to become the subject of a federal criminal investigation, and that any divorce proceedings will need to wait until the criminal matters are resolved. I headed toward the door. Oh, and Theodore? You might want to review your firm's policies about representing clients who've provided false information about federal crimes. I'd hate for this to affect your partnership status. As I left the conference room, I could hear Cameron's voice rising in panic, demanding that Theodore fix this somehow. But the damage was done. The confident predator who'd entered that room had been exposed as just another criminal who'd gotten caught, and his expensive attorney had realized he was representing someone whose crimes could destroy both their careers. The tables hadn't just turned, they'd been completely flipped. The phone calls started at 6:47 p.m. that same evening. Cameron's name flashed on my screen repeatedly as I sat in my home office, calmly preparing additional documentation for the FBI meeting scheduled for the following morning. I let the first 7 calls go to voicemail, knowing that desperation would make him more careless with his words. When I finally answered on the 8th call, Cameron's voice was raw with panic. "Elena, thank God you picked up. We need to talk immediately. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand." "Has it, Cameron? I thought everything was going exactly according to your plan. Didn't you tell Theodore that I was financially irresponsible and needed professional help?" "Elena, please. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but calling the FBI was extreme. We're talking about destroying my entire life over what amounts to some tax discrepancies and relationship problems. The audacity of calling federal crimes tax discrepancies almost made me laugh. Cameron, you committed fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy. You fabricated evidence to frame me for a gambling addiction and bribed witnesses to perjure themselves. These aren't relationship problems, they're felonies. Look, maybe I made some mistakes with the business accounting, and maybe Vivien and I got carried away with protecting the assets, but we can fix this. I'll pay whatever back taxes are owed, and we can handle the divorce quietly without involving federal prosecutors." I could hear the desperation bleeding through his attempt to sound reasonable. "Cameron, it's too late for that. The FBI isn't interested in your promises to pay back taxes. They're interested in your pattern of criminal behavior and your international money laundering operation. Elena, I'm begging you. Call off the FBI. I'll give you whatever you want in the divorce. Half the business, the house, spousal support, everything. Just make this federal investigation go away. You seem to be under the impression that I control federal law enforcement, Cameron. Once evidence of federal crimes is presented to prosecutors, I can't just call them off because you're scared." There was a long pause before Cameron's tone shifted to something approaching rage. "Elena, you're destroying both our lives out of spite. Do you have any idea what this will do to your reputation in Millbrook Harbor? People will think you're vindictive and unstable. Let me understand this correctly, Cameron. You're threatening my reputation while you're about to be arrested for federal crimes? That's an interesting strategy. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm trying to save our marriage and our future. We could work through this if you weren't being so vindictive." The suggestion that we could work through his systematic fraud and adultery was so absurd that I almost hung up. "Cameron, there is no marriage to save. You ended it when you decided to commit federal crimes to steal my assets and frame me with fabricated evidence. Elena, please. I love you. I know I made mistakes, but we can rebuild. Vivien means nothing. To me, she was just a business arrangement that got out of hand." Now he was trying the reconciliation angle, probably suggested by Theodore as a last-ditch strategy. A business arrangement? Cameron, you were planning to marry her with my money after you destroyed my reputation and left me with nothing. That was never real, Elena. I was just telling her what she wanted to hear to keep her quiet about the business irregularities. You're my wife, you're the only woman I've ever truly loved. The lies were becoming more desperate and creative. Cameron, I have your text messages saying you couldn't wait to divorce your useless wife and start a perfect life with your beautiful girlfriend. Those don't sound like empty promises to keep someone quiet. By 10:30 p.m., Cameron had called. 14 more times, each conversation following the same pattern, desperate bargaining followed by anger, then back to begging and promises of reconciliation. He offered me increasingly absurd settlement packages, including giving me the entire business, multiple properties, and his classic car collection. The really pathetic part came around midnight when he showed up at my front door, apparently having driven directly from the Harbor View Hotel where he'd been staying. Through the security camera, I could see him pacing on my porch, occasionally stopping to ring the doorbell or knock frantically. "Elena, I know you're in there. Please, just give me 5 minutes to explain everything face to face." I activated the intercom system. "Cameron, go back to your hotel. We have nothing to discuss that can't be handled through attorneys." "Elena, I'm not leaving until you listen to me. I've been standing out here for an hour thinking about everything we've built together. 12 years of marriage can't just disappear because of some business mistakes." "Some business mistakes?" "Cameron, you committed federal crimes and tried to frame me for gambling addiction. That's not a mistake, that's a calculated criminal conspiracy. I was protecting our assets. Everything I did was to make sure we'd be financially secure. The offshore accounts, the business arrangements with Vivien, it was all about building wealth for our future together." The revisionist history was stunning. He was now claiming that his money laundering operation had been for our benefit, despite the documented evidence that he'd been planning to divorce me and keep everything for himself. "Cameron, I have your text messages planning to leave me with nothing. You specifically discussed how to make sure I got minimal spousal support and no business assets. Those messages were just contingency planning. I wanted to make sure that if something happened to our marriage, I could protect what I'd built. But I never actually wanted a divorce, Elena. This whole thing with Vivien was just a midlife crisis that got out of control." His attempt to reframe systematic fraud and adultery as a midlife crisis was almost impressive in its shamelessness. At 2:15 a.m., Cameron finally left my property, but not before leaving a handwritten letter under my front door. The letter was 6 pages of increasingly desperate promises, including offers to enter counseling, cut all ties with Vivien, liquidate all offshore accounts, and sign post-nuptial agreements giving me control of all marital assets. The most telling part of the letter was his final paragraph: "Elena, I know you think I'm a terrible person, but I'm just a man who made some bad decisions while trying to protect what we've built together. Please don't let federal prosecutors destroy both our lives over mistakes that we can fix privately. I'll do anything to save our marriage and avoid prison. Please call off the FBI and give us a chance to rebuild." Reading that letter, I realized that Cameron still didn't understand the fundamental reality of his situation. He thought this was about our marriage, about forgiveness, about second chances. He couldn't comprehend that this had moved far beyond personal relationships into federal criminal territory where his preferences and promises were completely irrelevant. Wednesday morning brought a new strategy. At 7 a.m., my doorbell rang, and I found Vivien Sterling standing on my porch, looking nothing like the confident co-conspirator from Cameron's photos. She appeared haggard, desperate, and completely out of her depth. "Mrs. Westfield, I'm Vivien Sterling. I think we need to talk." Through the intercom, I responded, "I have nothing to discuss with you, Miss Sterling. If you want to confess your crimes, I suggest you contact the FBI directly." "Please, Mrs. Westfield. I know you hate me, and you have every right to, but Cameron has convinced me that we can work something out. I'm willing to testify against him if you'll help me avoid federal charges." The desperation was now spreading to Cameron's co-conspirator, and she was trying to cut a deal before the FBI meeting. But she was 12 hours too late. I'd already provided the federal prosecutors with everything they needed to prosecute both of them. "Miss Sterling, you should contact a criminal defense attorney immediately. Federal prosecutors don't negotiate." with unrepresented defendants, and anything you say to me can be used as evidence against you. As Vivien left my property, I realized that Cameron's entire criminal enterprise was collapsing in real time, with both conspirators now desperately trying to save themselves from the consequences of their own actions. The confident criminals who'd planned to destroy my life were now reduced to begging on my doorstep at dawn, the FBI meeting on Thursday morning went exactly as I'd anticipated. Federal Prosecutor James Rodriguez and Detective Sarah Chin treated my evidence presentation like a masterclass in financial crimes investigation. The conference room at the federal building filled with agents and prosecutors as word spread that a major money laundering case was being handed to them on a silver platter. Elena, this is the most comprehensive financial fraud documentation I've seen in 15 years of prosecution, James said as he reviewed my organized files. You've essentially done 90% of our investigative work for us. Detective Chin was particularly impressed with the digital evidence. The text message conversations between your husband and Miss Sterling read like a confession to multiple federal crimes. They documented everything: the money laundering, the witness bribery, the document forgery, even their plans to frame you. Within 3 hours of my presentation, federal warrants were issued for both Cameron and Vivien. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit moved with stunning efficiency, simultaneously raiding Cameron's business, his hotel room, Vivien's apartment, and 3 different locations where they'd been storing fraudulent documents. By 2 p.m., Cameron was in federal custody, and the local news was reporting that prominent Millbrook Harbor businessman Cameron Westfield had been arrested on charges of money laundering, tax evasion, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The news footage showed him being led from the Harbor View Hotel in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confident demeanor completely gone. Vivien Sterling was arrested at the document forgery company she'd been using, apparently trying to destroy evidence when the FBI arrived. Her attempt to destroy evidence added obstruction of justice charges to her already extensive criminal liability. The federal asset forfeiture process began immediately. Within 48 hours, Cameron's offshore accounts were frozen, his yacht brokerage was seized as an instrument of criminal activity, and even his personal Porsche was impounded as an asset purchased with criminal proceeds. The $2.8 million he'd hidden in international accounts was traced and recovered, along with an additional $1.2 million in assets the FBI discovered during their investigation. Theodore Blackstone became a footnote in the criminal proceedings. His law firm quietly withdrew from representing Cameron after federal prosecutors made it clear that any attorney who'd been informed of criminal activity could face their own charges for conspiracy after the fact. Theodore's partnership at Blackstone, Rivers and Associates ended within a week, though the firm claimed it was an early retirement rather than termination for professional misconduct. The most satisfying moment came 3 weeks later when I received a call from the federal prosecutor's office. Cameron had agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 12 years in federal prison. As part of his plea agreement, he'd been required to liquidate all remaining assets to pay restitution for his tax evasion and to compensate victims of his money laundering operation. Mrs. Westfield, James Rodriguez explained during our phone call, your husband's guilty plea includes a complete admission of his fraudulent divorce evidence. He's confessed to fabricating bank statements, bribing witnesses, and forging legal documents. This confession will be filed as public record. The public vindication was even more complete than I'd hoped. Cameron's confession detailed every aspect of his conspiracy against me, making it clear to anyone who read the court documents that I'd been the victim of an elaborate criminal scheme rather than an unstable spouse with financial problems. Vivien Sterling received 8 years in federal prison after her own guilty plea. Her cooperation against Cameron earned her a slightly reduced sentence, but federal judges aren't particularly sympathetic to defendants who actively participate in creating fraudulent evidence. Her legal career was permanently over, and her desperate attempt to destroy a marriage for money had cost her everything. The asset recovery process worked in my favor in ways I hadn't anticipated. As Cameron's spouse, I was entitled to recover my share of legitimately earned marital assets. But as the victim of his financial crimes, I was also entitled to restitution for the economic damage his schemes had caused me. The federal court awarded me $3.7 million in total, more than Cameron had ever legitimately earned during our entire marriage. The house on Seaview Drive became mine through the divorce proceedings, which resumed after the criminal cases were resolved. With Cameron in federal prison and his assets forfeited, the divorce was remarkably simple. I kept everything of value, including the Victorian mansion that had been our home, while Cameron signed papers from his prison cell renouncing any claim to marital property, but the financial victory was nothing compared to the professional vindication. Word spread quickly through the forensic accounting community about how I'd uncovered and prosecuted my own husband's criminal enterprise. Law firms from across the region began contacting me for consultation on complex financial crimes cases. The FBI offered me a permanent consulting position with their financial crimes unit. 6 months after Cameron's arrest, I established Hartwell Forensic Consulting, specializing in uncovering hidden assets and financial fraud in divorce proceedings. My first case involved a pharmaceutical executive who'd been hiding $8 million in cryptocurrency accounts from his wife. My second case exposed a hedge fund manager who'd been using charitable foundations to launder money during his divorce. The criminal referrals from these cases led to additional federal prosecutions. The irony wasn't lost on me that Cameron's attempt to destroy my career had actually launched me into the most successful period of my professional life. Law firms that had previously seen me as a competent local accountant now recognized me as someone who could handle the most complex financial crimes investigations. Millbrook Harbor's reaction to the scandal was everything I'd hoped for. The society pages that had once featured Cameron and me as the perfect power couple now ran articles about my success in exposing financial crimes and helping other women protect themselves from fraudulent spouses. The same social circle that Cameron had thought would judge me for being vindictive instead celebrated me for bringing a criminal to justice. Dr. Pemberton, the family physician who'd been manipulated into supporting Cameron's fake mental health claims, contacted me personally to apologize. He explained that Cameron had presented him with fabricated evidence of my supposed gambling behavior and had convinced him that intervention was necessary. The doctor's willingness to admit his mistake and to serve as a witness in other cases involving spousal manipulation helped restore my faith in people's ability to recognize when they'd been deceived. A year after Cameron's arrest, I received a letter from him in federal prison. The letter was a rambling, self-pitying document that blamed everyone except himself for his situation, me for being vindictive, Vivien for being manipulative, Theodore for being incompetent, and the federal justice system for being unfair to successful businessmen. I threw the letter away without finishing it. Cameron still didn't understand that his criminal behavior had consequences that extended far beyond his personal desires and convenience. He'd spent so long believing that his wealth and connections made him untouchable that even federal prison hadn't taught him accountability. Today, I live in our beautifully renovated Victorian mansion overlooking Millbrook Harbor, running a successful consulting business that helps other victims of financial fraud. The yacht slips where Cameron once conducted his money laundering operations now house boats owned by clients who trust me to protect their assets from criminal spouses. Sometimes I walk down to the harbor in the evening and look out at the water where Cameron thought he was building an empire. Instead, he built a federal case that destroyed his life and launched mine into something far better than I'd ever imagined possible. The man who'd called me useless and not worth his name had inadvertently proven that I was worth far more than he'd ever understood. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, especially when your enemies are doing it from prison. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.